I still desperately desire to hear God's voice. I want to know him, to feel him, to know him more personally. Um, and we long for that relationship where the communication is clear and direct. And it's like, okay, I'm trusting that whatever God's doing or not doing, he's God. Oh man, I need to trust him in that. But still, I want to hear his voice. I want to know him. And I can't think of, to stand before God and to be embraced by him. I can't think of a more fulfilling moment. That's literally the purpose of our existence.
Silence is a spiritual practice in a lot of Christian traditions. But what do we do? How do we handle it when it seems that God is silent? Luke, you wrote an essay recently on the silence of God. What do you mean when you say that God feels silent? In what way is God silent?
Yeah, I mean, it's a sense of you're trying to reach out to God and you don't feel anything. I think it's more of a feeling, it's a subjective, it's a personal sort of experience or lack of, where Jesus said before his ascension, "I'll never leave you nor forsake you." But then you feel on your own. Sometimes when you're in your walk in life and you're calling out to God, you don't feel like he's there or that he's listening. You feel on your own. And we can all think of places in our lives where, for those of us who are Christian, where that's been the case. I can think of plenty of examples where people I know have been suffering quite intensely and I've prayed to God, like just really just wanting to see these people healed and helped, and you get nothing. There's been times where I've looked at the world, looked at some of the moral ignorance sweeping society and just pleaded to God, like perform a sign or wonder, do something just to wake us up. And again, there's nothing. There's been times where even in my own self, where I've been really struggling personally, feeling really down for quite a while and called out to God countless times. And again, you just don't feel any sort of response back. And so that's what I mean by the silence of God. It's challenging because we have these promises that he's always there, that he's always around us and he always hears us. At the same time, sometimes in long periods in our lives where it doesn't feel like that's the case. And so that's what I mean by the silence of God. And it's not just the biblical writers experience this too. So in Habakkuk, I think it's verse 2 of chapter 1, it writes, "How long shall I cry out to you, God, and you will not answer? Even cry out violence and you will not save." And Psalm 74, it's basically David, I think it's David writing this extract, where he's basically saying, God, where are you? The world mocks you. People hate you. They resent you. What aren't you going to stand up for yourself? I don't see any prophets. I don't see any miracles or wonders from you. And so David's almost having this heart cry out where he's like, God, it feels like you should be defending yourself here. The world hates you and mocks you. Your enemies get stronger. And it just seems like you're silent in the midst of it. And so the biblical writers kind of wrestled with it. And so that's really you could say the problem of silence. It's that you've got those promises that God's there and he cares. And yet at the same time, in how you experience and relational, it can feel one way. That's what I would say when I'm referring to when I talk about the silence of God in that sense.
Yeah, I get that. I guess as a new Christian, sometimes when we wrestle with things, with difficulties, where is God in this situation, whatever, it can be very comforting to read some of the Psalms, and the psalmist is like a bit angry at God, and it's like, are we allowed to do this? But to think, we believe that God has like superintended what ends up in Scripture. He's inspired things, and he's led his people throughout the centuries, throughout the millennia, to put these angry psalms at himself, these angry songs, in this big compendium of authoritative of text about our relationship with God. So it's kind of comforting that God has decided that songs of anger and questioning are going to be in there, because it's a sign that actually he wants us to contend with him, to ask him these deep questions, and so we can. That's comforting that there are psalms like that in Scripture. But at the end of the day, like, we're just left with words to say to him. We're like, does the silence of God actually make you doubt his existence? It still leaves us with big questions like that, doesn't it?
Yeah. But just before we get onto that, I think it's really important, by the way, to be able to admit to it. And I know
Mm.
there can be a tendency in the church to not um, people don't want to say that they struggle with God at
Yeah.
times, and they try and hide it and always try and defend it and always try and defend the faith, and that's good. But you've got to be real with yourself at the same time, because people from the outside will see straight through that. So it's good to sit there and be like, you know what, I'm praying to God, I'm trying to reach out, but it does feel like I feel on my own, and there's got to be that heart cry there. I think for people on the outside to see that you're still authentic about
Mm.
how you're navigating your Christian faith. But on that question there regarding does it make you doubt God's existence? It's made me doubt uh, some of my perceptions of God, particularly from when I first started to become intrigued into Christianity to now. My
Yeah.
perceptions of God have somewhat changed, and not necessarily in a negative way, but um, it's made me doubt some of the prior views or the prior ways I conceived God. And I guess this is a quite a common thing where a lot of times in the church and a lot of times when you hear about God, particularly from the outside, so from people outside the faith, when they hear the Christian community talk about God, he's so loving and caring and kind, and which are all good and true things. But then you kind of see the side of God, which is very real. And when you read the biblical stories, it's like, gosh, this is challenging. God's not a game. Like, he's pretty tough going. And so you see this other side of God, which is not to be messed with, which is somewhat to behold and to fear, compared to this God where he's always kind and he's always nice and he's always there to which is true of God. But you there's a worry that you get this one-sided view of God, and not that it contradicts the other, but there's a concern that becoming overly focused there, you kind of get this misconception of God. And then when he's not always feeling there 100% of the time, you start to fall away. But what I was saying that to that question is the psychological challenges that I have with God don't necessarily undermine the rational and intellectual reasons I have for believing in God.
Right.
So I've had struggles with God. I find certain times in my walk there's some difficulty, but it doesn't make me not believe in God, because that would be me saying, well, because it doesn't fit how my preference of God should be, I'm therefore no longer going to believe in him. But I've got those intellectual, those rational reasons. And it doesn't undermine that. So, and I think belief in God, and if we vaguely define God, and I hate doing this, so I don't like trying to define God, but just for the argument, for the sake of argument, as a transcendent mind acts as the source for our existence, the ultimate source for our existence. I do think that believing in God is rational, logical, and intuitive. The alternative, to say that we live in a completely godless world, to look at the universe, all the infinite complexity and all the wonder, and to say that that's some sort of cosmic coincidence just driven by a random first cause, is irrational.
Yeah,
So if I
right.
compare those two notions, that there is an intentionality behind existence and there isn't, that's far more reasonable as far as I'm concerned. And C.S. Lewis wrote, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator. And he's right about that. The whole frame of nature, it signifies of a sort of intentionality there, of an order. And that order, in all of our experience, arises from intentionality, from mind, from intelligence. And so I think that there's I don't buy into the notion that physics is completely self-referring. And I think that's actually completely anti-scientific. I think it's that what science has and is revealing shows us how unreasonable it is to cling to naturalistic worldviews, and how reasonable it is to invoke a sort of mind in the explanation of it all. So I do think that God is more reasonable than the alternative, to say there is no God. Also, I don't think you can consistently live fully to the implications of a godless worldview. So as far as I'm concerned, and I've thought about philosophical atheism a lot, the most logical conclusion when you follow the threads seems to me that if you want to take it right to the end, you end up with nihilism. I don't see a logical and escape for that. Richard Dawkins wrote, "There is at bottom no purpose, no meaning, no right, no wrong, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference." But it's like, do you live like that? You don't live like that. And as far as I'm concerned, the most logical implication of philosophical atheism is nihilism, but true nihilism lived out as suicide, and so no one can live out the fruit of that worldview. And so that's the problem I kind of see there. It's like you can't actually be consistent with the full implications of what that worldview would suggest. And to try and bypass that conclusion, I just don't find it rational. I just don't find you're being honest or consistent with how that worldview flows. A lot of my atheist friends would tell me that morality is no more than an illusion fostered onto us by evolution. But it's like, but you don't live like it's an illusion. You live as if there's something about morality or something about certain rules, such as, rape is wrong, which is objective, which is the case regardless of culture, history, context, regardless of a survival strategy. Certain actions are right or wrong regardless.
Yeah.
Which I agree with, but the point is that I don't think their worldview can substantiate that. And so there's a point there where I think that believing in God is rational. I think the alternative is irrational. And I don't think you can be consistent with the alternative as well. Not only that, but when I look into so not only do I kind of buy into this vague notion of God, but when I look into the gospel accounts and I look into the death and resurrection of Christ, I do believe in that too. So when I look at the historical evidence for the death and resurrection of Christ, I can't deny that. And William Lane Craig has done a great job in kind of arguing for the historical case for the death and resurrection and why it's reasonable. And to deny the resurrection of Christ, you have to propose completely implausible scenarios to reconcile the historical evidence with a secular worldview. And there's nothing about that which is appropriate. So I do believe in the gospel accounts. And because I believe in the gospel accounts, I'm led to take seriously the entire Judeo-Christian narrative.
Yeah. So
to get back to what you're saying, the silence of God, some of the psychological challenges I have doesn't undermine and I've only just touched on that, some of the rational and intellectual reasons I have for believing in God. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it sounds like there's a whole load more podcast episodes that could come out of this. So it's good. This is the third episode.
We could carry on, but yeah.
I'm sure
I don't want to make that the focus of.
Yeah.
I don't want to make that the focus
absolutely.
of this because, but yeah, it's worth.
Yeah. So there's personal reasons we could have for believing in God, personal experiential reasons. But in the absence of those, so in the silence of God, there are other reasons, rational, intellectual reasons. There's the world we see around us, which is experiential with then rational inference from it, but it's not direct experience of God. But still, there are other reasons that lead you to believe in God. But still, it's still a personal felt issue.
Yeah.
It's still a personal ache in the heart. Not feeling such a nearness with God. How have you come to terms with that?
I accept that God is a mystery, and he doesn't fit into our categories. And I've realized that we all have our desires of how we want God to be and how we think God should be to us, to people around us. And you have to let go of that. I think you have to let go of trying to control how God ought to be, and have to accept in part that he is a mystery. And I have to accept that God knows and sees more than I do. And because of that, whatever his actions are or lack of actions, he doesn't need to give an explanation to me. Paul the Apostle, in fact, even in Isaiah, they write about this. So they sit there and say, like, does God come to you for counsel? Does he need your wisdom? Since when does God need your advice? or people are sitting there thinking they know better than God. It's like, since when does God need to come to you to get your advice and your guidance? He doesn't. He's God. He knows everything. He sees everything. He sees the bigger picture and you don't. And there's an element of there that I actually kind of need to just rest in that and trust that whatever God's doing or not doing, he knows what's best and he sees the bigger picture, and I don't. So there's a sense of humility there where you kind of just have to sit back and think, God's God and I'm man. and I need to accept that I need to accept that in my heart, that he's going to do things which I don't understand, which I don't quite get. I'm going to trust that he knows and sees more than I do.
Yeah.
Because he is God. He is the ultimate transcendent mind. He is the beginning and the end. The alternative is you can get resentful. So you can turn to resentment. God isn't listening to me. Doesn't hear me. And you get resentful in your heart towards God, and bitter and twisted. And I don't think that's the answer. I don't think that's a good idea. And you see that a lot. I've seen a lot of people turn into resentment where they've prayed to God, haven't had answers. They've been on a Christian walk.
Yeah.
Doesn't feel like God's there. And they've turned to resentment and bitterness. And then they've become atheistic, saying, well, there is no God. But there's still that bitter resentment there in the way they talk about God. So that's kind of the way I've come to terms with it, I think, which is basically saying that God knows and sees more than I do. And who am I really to question God? He doesn't need my counsel. He doesn't need my guidance to do things the way that I want him to do it. I need to trust and rest in that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the answer is that, well, essentially God doesn't need to explain himself to me. I can't even make an atom out of nothing. So let alone a sky or a planet or a universe. I just need to trust him. I think there's a deep wisdom in that, in approaching this whole question with humility. In reality, though, in the everyday of our lives, how does that actually help? How does that? How should that affect what I do today, tomorrow? There's still the ache and the longing in the heart, isn't there?
Yeah, no, you're right. You know what? It sort of contradict myself. It doesn't really help because I still desperately desire to hear God's voice. I want to know him, to feel him, to know him more personally. And we long for that relationship where the communication is clear and direct. And it's like, okay, I'm trusting that whatever God's doing or not doing, he's God. Oh man, I need to trust him in that. But still, I want to hear his voice. I want to know him. And I can't think of, to stand before God and to be embraced by him. I can't think of a more fulfilling moment. That's literally the purpose of our existence. And so there's that sort of frustration, there's that agony where I don't know God as well as I would like. And I'd be foolish to think that I can know God and figure him out, but I still want more. I can turn to the Bible, I can read the scriptures, and you do get an understanding of God. And I can pray to him, but still it's not enough. It's not enough. It's a sort of interim where this will do for now, but it's still like I'm still wanting more. And so the answer doesn't really help, I think, in the day-to-day. There's still a difficulty there. There's still a wrestle. And do you know what? Through reading the Bible and reading the biblical stories, if I've learned anything, it's that trusting in God is going to be bloody difficult. You think about Abraham. He's called by God to leave home and country. And the first thing which happens to him is, well, he goes into famine. He goes into war, exile. His nephew gets kidnapped. I think on 2 or 3 occasions, he almost loses his wife to more powerful men. And it's like, he's being called by God and nothing's turning out the way which it feels like it should do. Later, you have Joseph, called by God to save Israel throughout the 7-year famine. And then what happens to him? He's sold by his brothers into slavery. He's abandoned by his own family, his own brothers, into slavery. And then in slavery, he gets arrested, wrongly gets arrested, and falsely accused of committing adultery with his master's wife. And so nothing seems to, in those moments, you could think nothing seems like it's going as it should be. God's called him, and look what's happened to his life. Moses, let's fast forward. Moses is called by God to deliver Israel from the tyranny of Egypt. And but before that, he's on the run. He flees Egypt, and he's living essentially as an outcast in hiding for 40 years. He's an outcast. He's a nobody for 40 years looking after sheep. God's called him. And then when he does eventually deliver Israel from, under God, deliver Israel from the tyranny of Egypt, as soon as they get out, Israel starts turning to idols. And he pretty much from then on, he faces nothing but difficulty and challenges, and he's an old man. So he hasn't got the same energy he probably did when he was young. Nothing but difficulty. Think about Job, right? He's a righteous man. He's a good guy. And he does the right thing. He's honest. He's fair. He's responsible. He's generous. And yeah, what happens to him? His livestock and gets completely killed or stolen. So his business basically goes out. His children die suddenly. He starts to suffer physically intensely. He gets these agonizing sores all over his body. His wife basically tells him that his life isn't worth living and he could probably just kill himself. And his friends tell him that all his suffering is basically just well-deserved karma, which just isn't the case. And so in all these cases, the biblical figures experience experience that frustration and perhaps even the loneliness from God to extents that I can't even comprehend. But does that mean that God isn't real and doesn't care? By no means. In every case, God showed up. Like if you look at all the biblical stories, in the end, God answered. And so I rest in that. And actually, I was thinking about recently, have you seen the Star Wars series, Obi-Wan?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is a spoiler alert for anyone else, but I really resonated with it. So Obi-Wan, he as you know, it's like 10 years since the Order of 66 and the fall of his apprentice, Anakin Skywalker. And he's living in the desert, essentially in hiding, looking over at Luke Skywalker from a distance. And he's trying to reach out to his former master, Qui-Gon?
Qui-Gon Jinn, yeah.
Is that right? That's the one. And he's trying to reach out to him from the afterlife, and he hears nothing. And the series really highlights how alone he is. And he's like this old guy, is not really the powerful Obi-Wan he once was, trying to reach out, and he's just got nothing. And anyway, he goes on this big journey, as you know. He saves Princess Leia, and he faces off Darth Vader, and he comes back home. And as he comes back to his desert homeland, he's greeted by Qui-Gon who's reached out to him from the afterlife. And Obi-Wan's just like, what the heck? I was beginning to think you would never come. And Qui-Gon says something like, I was always here, Obi-Wan, you just weren't ready to see me. And they walk off into the desert with Qui-Gon saying they've got a lot of work to do. And in a strange way, after watching that, I was sitting there thinking, like, I feel like Obi-Wan. I feel like that need to hold on to God, to not give up, not to give in to resentment, because most people do give up, and it is hard, and there's lots of reasons to give up, and so there's lots of feelings to give up on, but I feel that need to hold on, and that God, one day God will answer that call, that I will know Him more personally, and that's not a blind faith or a blind hope, by the way. It's because of the gospel, because of the gospel account and the historical evidence for the death and resurrection of Christ. God emptied Himself for the redemption of a relationship with mankind. He went the full way. And so because of that, I have reason to believe that God, He does want a close personal relationship with us. I might not understand everything right now. I might try and reach out to Him and don't understand why things feel silent. But ultimately, I'm trusting in what He's done. And I'm going to go through this life with that hope because of the gospel, that my longings for God will be met. That's kind of what keeps me going. And I think that's what kind of keeps a lot of Christians going. There's that hope at the end. There's that light at the end of the dark tunnel. And it's not blind. It's not just wishful, hopeful thinking. It's based on an historical event which has happened in time, which we have evidence for, which gives us hope. And so it's reasonable. It's a reasonable hope. And so, until then, whether I have to wait days, months, years, perhaps even my entire life, I'm confident that my longings for God will be met. And in the meantime, I'm going to try and seek to do what's right in life, to be responsible, to constantly reflect and think about how I can be a better person and how I can better honor God and honor others around me. But ultimately, God is God and I'm man. And He might not be obvious, but He is inevitable. Throughout the fraternal scripture, there's a time where we'll all know God, we'll all see God, perhaps not know God, but we'll all see God. And we'll stand before Him in salvation or final judgment. So it's set. that longing for God, it's set. There's that ultimate salvation. There's the ultimate redemption of the relationship when it comes to fruition because of the gospel. And I have hope in that. That even if God feels silent now, and even if I don't understand what he does or doesn't do, there's a promise there and I'm standing on it. That's hard. I think that's hard to really, it's easy to say, but hard to live that out. And that's kind of the wrestle of the Christian walk. It's some things we easily say it, but it's trying to live and actually put our trust in that, which is the challenge. So
that's beautiful. That's profound. I think often what we ask for in times of struggle is communication from God. God, where should I go? What should I do?
Yeah.
Why is this happening? We want answers, but what we need is communion. What we need is to know that God cares, that he's near. What we ask for is sympathy and direction, but what we need is his empathy. And I remember when we were going through a few months when my dad had terminal illness, passed away with cancer quite a few years ago. And there was a marked difference between people that seemed to offer sympathy and they tried to bring solutions with words, but none of the words are going to bring my dad back. What I needed was people to just sit with me, to know their nearness, not necessarily their words. And that can be more heart-wrenching when we don't know that God cares. Like we just need something to know that he's near, that he's present. But I think you mentioned Joseph, you mentioned Abraham. I wonder if it's something that's key to everyone's walk with God, and that it's a key part. You said about Obi-Wan, about Qui-Gon Jinn saying that he just wasn't ready to see him yet. And I do wonder if it's a key part of all our lives that most of us we're not ready. But as we go through the dark night of the soul, the difficult time, and still cling on to God, then that will do something in us that will make us ready to be with him, because we're not just with him because of the fun times, because we see him right in front of us. And so one of these characters that come to mind when we talk about the dark night of the soul is Mother Teresa. She famously had these times of deep feeling, not knowing whether God exists and just feeling cut off from him, deep depression. And it was a reporter that asked her once, when you pray to God, what do you pray about? And she said, I don't pray, I just listen. And the reporter said, well, what does God say? And she said, he doesn't say anything, he just listens. So there's so at the start where I mentioned how silence can be a spiritual practice, perhaps it's one of God's spiritual practices as well, in that it's the way that he interacts with us in drawing our hearts after him. Because at the start of every romantic relationship, you don't know the person completely. If the relationship is to progress in a healthy and wholesome way, you don't start naked, physically or emotionally. There's a mystery. Who is this person? And there's like a pursuit because of the hiddenness. And you're wanting to get to know the person. And slowly over time, you get to know them in deeper and more intimate ways. So it starts with a hiddenness, and it's the pursuit that's part of the falling in love and building a relationship. And so I think, in a sense, God keeps himself covered, distant, so that in living our lives through the longing after him, there's like a relationship that's deeper, that's built. And you mentioned Joseph and Abraham, how they had these moments of feeling forsaken by God, and I wonder if that is something that's part of all our experience with God, a necessary part. And that, of course, took me on to Jesus. Well, did Jesus experience the silence of God, being God himself? And of course, on the cross, he cried out famously, my God, why have you forsaken me?
Why have you forsaken me?
And in that, he's not just ad-libbing. I think all Jews around at the time, being deeply immersed in scriptures, if someone wants to refer to a whole psalm, they would say the first line. And so I think he's bringing up Psalm 22, which starts, my God, why have you forsaken me? So quoting that, their minds would have gone to the whole thing. And it's a messianic psalm. It speaks of Christ, of the Messiah. It goes, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me? So far from my cries of anguish. My God, I cry out by day and you do not answer by night, and I find no rest. It goes on to say, You brought me out of the womb.
That's a hard
You
sign,
made me
isn't
trust
it?
in you even at my
Yeah.
mother's breast. From birth I was cast on you. From a mother's womb you have been my God. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart has turned to wax. It is melted within me. I lie in the dust of death. My bones are on display. People stare and gloat over me. They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment. It says about how people
prophecy
have pierced his hands and feet. So speaking of the Christ, it starts with, my God, why have you forsaken me? And it ends with, they will proclaim his righteousness, declaring to a people yet unborn, he has done it. And of course, Jesus' words on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? And he finishes with, it is finished. And so even God experienced forsakenness. Even God experienced the silence of God. In what Christ has done, he's taken on all the pain and all the suffering, all the forsakenness of humanity. He has experienced, he knows what it's like to go through feeling forsaken, feeling like God is far off and not helping out. And so at least we can find comfort in that there is a closeness of God to our experience, in that he has experienced feeling far, he's experienced feeling forsaken. Christ is God's expression of his empathy. He is God with us. So because Christ experienced it, therefore we know that God knows what it's like. He has experienced it from both ends. But we can trust, like you say, you're speaking of Job, that God knows what's up. We can trust that he has it in hand, and he knows and he feels our pain. I was chatting with this whole topic actually with a friend of mine last Wednesday, just recently. And what came to mind?
So just add to what you were saying there. That just before you move on there, but that perhaps in that silence it kind of brews on that longing for God, and that sort of. I do wonder whether it's the way God tests us to see: are you going to persevere? Are you going to hold on? Are you going to give up? Because many have. So I do wonder whether it's also like a form of test. I know the common atheist will say, well, it's because God's not real. But I do actually wonder whether there's something in there where God's testing us. Are you going to pursue this? Or are you going to give up? Because it's hard.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry.
I was just about to read a section from Screwtape Letters, chapter 8. And that what you said fits in perfectly with this. Screwtape Letters, a book written by C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Narnia Chronicles, and it's one side of a letter correspondence between two demons. So this is the letters from the senior demon to his junior, from Wormwood to Screwtape. I think it was that way around. Yeah. Anyway, and at the end of this chapter, so he as a demon is writing, the enemy, as he writes, is God. So writing to the junior demon, he writes, you must have often wondered why the enemy does not make more use of his power to be sensibly present to human souls in any degree he chooses and at any moment. But you now see that the irresistible and the indisputable are the two weapons which the very nature of his scheme forbids him to use. Merely to override a human will, as his felt presence in any but the faintest and most mitigated degree would certainly do, would be for him useless. He cannot ravish, he can only woo. For his ignoble idea is to eat the cake and have it. The creatures are to be one with him, but yet themselves. Merely to cancel them or assimilate them will not serve. He is prepared to do a little overriding at the beginning. He will set them off with communications of his presence which, though faint, seem great to them, with emotional sweetness, with easy conquest over temptation. But he never allows this state of affairs to last long. Sooner or later, he withdraws, if not in fact, at least from their conscious experience, all those supports and incentives. He leaves the creature to stand up on its own legs, to carry out from the will alone duties which have lost all relish. It is during such trough periods, much more than during the peak periods, that it is growing into the sort of creature he wants it to be. Hence, the prayers offered in the state of dryness are those which please him best. We can drag our patience along by continual tempting, because we design them only for the table, and the more their will is interfered with, the better. He cannot tempt to virtue, as we do to vice. He wants them to learn to walk, and must therefore take away his hand. And if only the will to walk is really there, he is pleased even with their stumbles. Do not be deceived, Wormwood. Our cause is never more in danger than when a human, no longer desiring but intending to do our enemy's will, looks round upon a universe from which every trace of him seems to have vanished, and asks why he has been forsaken, and still obeys. And just to close up, it just reminded me of when the risen Christ appears before his disciples, and they all meet him apart from Thomas, who turns up late, and he says, unless I put my fingers in the holes in his hands and his wound in his side, I won't believe.
Yeah.
To him, the whole idea is too absurd, and there's a silence in front of him. There's no evidence. And Christ appears in the room, and Thomas is able to embrace him, says, my Lord and my God. He finally sees. The silence is over. And Jesus says to him, you believe because you see. Blessed are those who believe without seeing. Now, of course, as he said, there are reasons. We can look around in the universe and see there is evidence of the fingerprint of God in the universe.
Yeah.
But it does seem that, sometimes we can believe because there's evidence, but there is a greater virtue in not a blind faith as such, but a trust in the one who can appear distant, can appear to forsake us sometimes.
But you still have all the evidence, but there's still a mystery to that figure, and there's still an element of trust there. And I think that's it. It's like, and that ultimate longing for God as it brews, if you hold on, if you persevere, as it brews, what a fulfilling moment when you do actually get embraced by God. What a moment. And maybe that's part of what, because I remember reading that from Jesus, blessed are those who have believed and have not seen. It's like, well, it doesn't feel that blessed, It feels quite the opposite, actually. But I wonder whether it's in the end, what a blessing.
A lot of Jesus' blessings,
in the end, when you
a lot of Jesus' blessings don't feel blessed early on, like blessed are the poor, blessed are the meek, blessed are the downtrodden, But because he is the God who's close to the crushed and broken in spirit, and because he's been crushed and broken in spirit, he a deeper blessing coming. Yeah.
This has been really helpful. Even just hearing your thoughts there, and really helpful to think it through. And I think it's a topic where you constantly have to bring it up, because actually it is difficult in the day-to-day. And there are moments when you feel a bit down about it, and you constantly have to have these conversations to sharpen each other up. And to be honest about it, to be honest about your walk with God. Don't dull it down. Don't pretend it's something which it might not be. Be real about it, because only then can you actually deal with it. You can't deal with it if you're trying to open it. You're trying to put this facade of what this relationship is, but it might not be that. Got to be honest.
Absolutely. I'd just like to pray to finish the podcast, if that's all right.
Okay. Go ahead. Yeah. Fine by me. Yeah.
Father, your Son felt forsaken. Thank you that you sent him so that he could understand from the inside, so that he could go through what we go through. Thank you that you understand, that you have deep empathy, that you are all already and always with us. Lord, will you lead us into deeper truth? Firstly, deeper truth about our own experience, our own difficulty with feeling forsaken and your silence. Help us to pray with an authenticity and a richness that trusts that you're willing to listen. And Lord, how will you lead us into deeper truth? Lead us into a deeper wisdom to know your nearness even when you don't feel close. And for those of us listening that this particularly speaks, that it particularly resonates with what we've been speaking about in this episode, just pray they'd feel the closeness of your spirit. You'd help them to find a deeper trust and a peace as we go through the ambiguity of life. Amen.
Amen. Smashing.